So the lesson that Israel learned in exile was that, well, God is not our God in the sense that God is not in our possession.
Yeah.
We don't have God in our pocket. So it's a humbling experience, I'd say, but also a hopeful experience, because, when God is so much entangled with your culture and your traditions and your institutions and the feeling of having power, then you can lose him. I think an exilic experience can help you to think really hard on what is crucial for being a Christian. Is it really crucial, for example, to control the nation, to have a Christian president, or all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
I don't think so, to be honest.
When our post-everything world has turned life upside down, how do you even know which end is up?
If you're committed to a community or a cause greater than yourself, you don't have the luxury of checking out or the freedom to burn out.
It's not enough to just keep surviving. We need to thrive again.
This is Post Everything,
a podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age.
Welcome to Post Everything. My name is John Homus, and today I'm actually flying solo without my co-host Brad Edwards. But today I've got a great guest on, Dr. Stefan Paas, who is a Dutch theologian and missiologist. Dr. Paas is the director of the Center for Church and Mission in the West, a professor of missiology at Theological University of Kampen, and he specializes in church planting in a post-Christian context. Now, I first became aware of Dr. Paas when I read his 2019 book, Pilgrims and Priests, Christian Mission in a Post-Christian Society. It's an absolute must-read, especially if you're a church planter. He also wrote a book in 2016 about church planting called Church Planting in the Secular West, Learning from the European Experience. And here's why I'm particularly excited about talking with Dr. Paas. We've heard a lot of different descriptions of our current cultural moment when it comes to its relationship to the Christian faith. We've heard about revival among Gen Z. We've heard about a vibe shift or even hostility towards the faith. And I think all of these are true at once. James Wood coined the phrase reality respecters about people who are open to Christianity because all of a sudden Christianity makes logical sense. While at the same time, Aaron Renn has used the term the negative world, saying that Christianity, society is no longer just neutral towards Christianity. Rather, society is against Christianity. It sees it as hostile and a liability. Now, Dr. Paas talks a lot about the motif of exile, the Old Testament people of God in exile in Babylon, but also the New Testament people of God in exile in society. And he sees a particular correlation between exile and secularization, how secularization has pushed the church, in a sense, to the margins in a post-Christian context. So I'm going to talk to him about this exile motif, but also about apathy towards spirituality in our cultural moment and how the church postures itself and how to foster and form and keep our identity as the people of God while in exile. So let's get into the interview now. I am here with Stefan Paas. Stefan, welcome to Post Everything.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you today about several different things, but one of the things that's been interesting in the United States is there's so much fracturing going on in our culture that it's really hard to name what's happening spiritually. For instance, there's a term called reality respecters that's been going around. I believe James Wood coined that phrase about people who agree with the way Christians would categorize society, but don't necessarily believe in Christianity. Aaron Renn has used a term called the negative world about how the culture is hostile to Christians. And then you've used a term in your book, Apatheism, where Christianity is not hated, it just doesn't feel relevant. People are indifferent to it.
Yeah.
So you say the crisis of mission in the West isn't primarily a freedom of choice, but rather Christianity just doesn't feel necessary or self-evident. What does it mean for the church when the gospel no longer feels culturally inevitable or even culturally relevant?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure that we can do a lot about it. I mean, the question, what we can do, already suggests a certain perspective on what our role is in the world. Maybe it's just a matter of praying and outwaiting it. Like I believe Rob Dreher once said in his Benedict option. Having said that, just for the record, the term apatheism is not my own term. I used it, but I think it's Philip Zuckerman, the American sociologist, who first used it. And it's a sort of, well, what is it? A crossbreed between atheism and apathy. So basically atheists would be people who still think that God or the subject of God is interesting enough to talk about and have certain questions that they may answer differently, but more or less the same questions as Christians have, like, is there a God? Or does he care about me? Or stuff like that. Whereas apatheists wouldn't even understand the questions or wouldn't think the questions are very relevant. They don't basically frame their life issues in religious terms or anti-religious terms. They just go with the flow. And that also means that Christianity or any other religious perspective is not a genuine alternative for them. It's not something they consider that as an option. Now, of course, human beings being what they are doesn't mean that people are apatheists all their lives. People can change. Actually, I think what we're seeing today in the West, in at least the more secular countries of the West, among the youngest generations, Gen Z or Gen Z, as the Brits say, is interesting because these generations, I'm not sure about America, but in Europe they would be the most secularized generations. Their parents, their grandparents wouldn't go to church. That seems to be not massively. It's a long shot from any revival or something like that, but definitely an increase in interest in religion, and especially in some, let's say, very orthodox or traditional forms of Christianity, like high church Roman Catholicism or Orthodox, Eastern Orthodoxy. Where the jury is still out. I mean, it's a very recent development, but it also shows that cultures can change. I mean, like David Martin, the British sociologist, once said, he's also a priest, by the way, a very famous sociologist of religion. He said secularization is not a law of nature. It's not like gravity. If you jump off a building, you can be pretty sure that you will crash. But secularization is the description of a social process that is, if you just boil it down to its core, it's the sum of millions of personal decisions. For example, not to go to church anymore, or just to leave it behind. Meaning that it can be changed. It can change its course. I'm not saying that it will be as it used to be, if that's desirable at all. Let's say the way things were 50 years or 100 years back. But it's very well possible that even in the most secular situations or contexts, people will grow new interests. So altogether, I'd say churches do not have a lot of options when it comes to apatheism, basically, apart from doing what they're good at: praying, helping the poor, proclaiming the gospel, and trying to be decent and honest and helpful and all the things that Christians are supposed to be. Just being good Christians. And we'll see. The history has shown that there will always be times when new groups of people start to grow in interest, and it may be that this is currently the case.
You mentioned...
So I'm sorry, I don't have revolutionary recipes here.
No.
To turn the tide. It's what it is.
Yeah, it's helpful to explore. You mentioned Christian proclamation, and in my own experience, just having been in churches in different cultures and different moments, there's the whole of proclamation of the gospel stays the same, and yet there's nuances that come out depending on the cultural moment and depending on the context. And what do you think Christian proclamation sounds like when in the midst of secularization, when it's no longer supported by things like cultural memory or even social usefulness?
It sounds exotic in a way. So I've met quite a few young people who sort of went to church. Well, not quite a few, but yeah, 5 or 6 who went to church basically because their parents didn't go, and they were a sort of adolescent rebellion. They said, well, let's try this out. It's exotic. Also because due to immigration, in Europe, at least in the cities, most young people would have some sort of immigration background, which means often a religious background, meaning that most of your friends, that's interesting, in a very secular society, people of my age tend to be surrounded by far more secular people than people below 25. There are far fewer. There are fewer of them. I'm a boomer, but they tend to live in context, peer groups where religion is far more normal. Think, for example, of European soccer teams. So the Dutch soccer team, for example, which is a world-class team, it's in the top 10 of the world. There's about 8 of 11 players there are religious Christians, and they talk about it very openly. They witness, they give interviews about it, and all that. So there's in this very secular culture also a sort of very well possible that a sort of new openness there. Let me go back to your question. Sorry, I was carried away with my own words.
It's all right. Real quick to interlude. Are any of those Dutch players? Did they also play for Liverpool? That are Christians?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, Virgil van
Virgil
Dijk
and Gakpo, of course.
Yes,
he's left winger. He's a very, very Christian guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a Liverpool supporter, so I had to ask.
Good for you. Yeah. Well, that was the interlude. What was the original question again? Help me, please.
What does Christian proclamation sound like in the midst of apatheism?
Yeah, there was something I wanted to say about that. So, obviously, it can't be like, let's say, the traditional revivalist sermon, which also assumes that people still believe in God and still respect the Bible and all that. That is no longer the case. So what I found, and of course there are different strategies there, but what I have good experience with is actually podcasting. Or in general, the internet plays a huge role for young generations nowadays, far more than media played a role, let's say classic radio, TV, for our generation. So if you look at France, for example, where they have an upsurge of converts in the young age groups in the Catholic Church, about 80% or 85% of them says, well, internet influencers, YouTube, TikTok have been instrumental and still are for me. And that is something we find in the Netherlands as well. So, but podcasting specifically, I have good experience with that. I think dovetails very well with a sort of new approach of evangelism that is advocated, for, among others, by, what's his name again, James Butler from Oxford. He says evangelism nowadays is conversation rather than sort of one directional proclamation, just preaching to people, if it has ever been that. But you still need the input. You still need the sermons, the books, the tracts and all that. But the actual work of evangelization happens afterwards, when people start to talk about it and have conversations about it. Probably that's always been the case, to be honest.
Yeah.
Even if you reel back all the way to, let's say, Augustine and his practice of preaching, you'll see that he was used to dialoguing with the crowds. When he preached, people asked questions, they jumped up, they started running, crying, whatever, and he responds to that. So it's very lively, it's very interactive. And podcasting, I'm a co-host of a podcast myself. We're doing it for 6 years now, and it's really lifted off. I mean, we've 300,000 listeners every month.
Wow.
Which is big for the Netherlands. Yeah. Given that we're a Dutch language podcast. And what I have found, even if you're not specific, maybe you found the same thing, I'm not sure, but even if you're not specifically aiming at evangelizing people, we're just Christians talking about things. Most of our guests are not Christians, but we have respectful conversations about life, about values, about the future of our culture and all that, art, science, whatnot. Almost every week I get emails or messages from people who say, I'm an atheist, but... Famous line to begin with. I'm an atheist, but I like what you're doing.
Yeah.
But also people who actually came to the faith, or people saying things like, the only reason I still go to church is because of this podcast. So, or fathers who write me, my daughter goes to church thanks to this podcast because she sees some Christians she can respect. I'm not trying to compliment myself here, but I mean, the general idea is apparently if there's out there in the public intelligent, well-meaning, decent conversations about faith, there's still a market for that, so to speak.
Yeah.
As long as people trust you, as long as they see that you don't have any hidden agendas or trying to talk down to them or condescending or just want to lecture them on morality and all that, which is, I think, an important thing in a society that has lost its Christian memory. You generally you don't want to start with telling them what's wrong about them.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We've found the same thing with Post Everything, that we've gotten some feedback from people who maybe have one foot out the door of the church and only one foot left in, and they've enjoyed the conversation just to be able to listen and hear some exploration of ideas and how Christianity interacts with culture. So that really,
it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that really resonates. You did mention the word rebellion. I thought that was an interesting word. Christian proclamation or even church going seems like rebellion, but in many ways there's a sense where it's countercultural formation. The worship service is where people learn how to speak the language of faith, and some things are taught in a worship service and some things are caught. But if a worship service and if worshiping together as the body of believers is like a reservoir where God language is kept alive, is Sunday worship actually one of the most like rebellious, radical missionary acts left for us in a post-Christian culture?
I like to think that is true, but maybe I'm just flattering myself here as a regular churchgoer. But yeah, I tend to think that there is something very relaxing and also something countercultural in just simply going to, as we do nowadays, to a village church just around the corner, because it's basically ineffective. There's no clock running. It isn't about money. It isn't about success. It's simply being there, just an hour, and listening to someone who tells you that you should love your neighbor and you should love God, and that you should help the poor, and that you should behave in all sorts of ways. I mean, I'm simplifying it very much, but you get the point. So there is something there that is not about making a success of your life or scoring likes on the internet. Or it's a very simple and it's very inefficient in a way, because it's just an hour doing nothing. What you could make money in that time, or post something impressive on Twitter,
right?
It's called today. So yeah, all that. Even because it is the cell phone free zone mostly in our church, not expressly so, but still, most people would still leave their cell phones in their pockets during church service. All that also is relaxing. Yeah, there is a sort of refreshing countercultural thing. On the other hand, we shouldn't over romanticize it. If I'm looking around in the pews on Sundays, there are still young people, sure, but it's mostly an aging crowd. And most of the people who are there have been raised in church, so they're sort of socialized in the habits and the routines. That's also true when I speak to young people who've come to the faith over the last few years, so the Gen Z people. Many of them, like I said, either go to very liturgical churches, not to the average Protestant church, or they don't go to church. They just take their diet from the internet, which I have mixed feelings about. I'm not the kind of guy, as you may have noticed, who likes to criticize new things. I'm basically pretty open to them, but I think as with all things in life, there's always a mix of sin and grace. And I would say the positive thing of the internet nowadays is that people can find high quality input everywhere. It's extremely good stuff. You can find it there. In terms of sermons, Bible studies, debates, whatever. And there's that, but also, of course, a lot of rubbish, and through the algorithms, you can be sucked into some pit that you don't want to be there, or you don't want to be. But anyways, there's both things, and as, let's say, opposed to good old-fashioned proclamation in church or on a soapbox on the streets or whatever, there is, for the people in the pews or the people in the Christian community, there's more to choose from, which, well, like I said, it's a mixed blessing. But it is what it is, generally. I'm not the kind of guy who would say we should pick all sorts of fights with our culture.
Yeah.
Usually, 100 years later, people look back and say, what were these people fighting about? I mean, so we shouldn't, in principle, let's say, burn books or be against all sorts of new techniques, but find smart ways to deal with that and to work with it. So, yeah.
I think for a lot of American Christians, there's a challenge for us because, you know, I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but a lot of times our faith and our identity as Americans or as a subgroup of Americans can often get really blurred. And I think as people feel that having power as Christians in our country kind of slips through our fingers, that really the identity even gets hardened in that confusion between who are we as Christians and who are we as Americans. And one of the things you do is you frame secularization as exile. It's not simply decline. It's part of learning to operate and function with a distinct Christian identity on the margins. What do you think exile can do positively to the church if we let it? And what does it burn away, or what does it clarify, and what could happen negatively? So as we think about exile and what it might do to the church, what do you see some of the possibilities being?
Well, I think, like you just hinted at, it sort of helps you to pick your battles. I mean, you should be very... I think an exilic experience can help you to think really hard on what is crucial for being a Christian. Is it really crucial, for example, to control the nation, to have a Christian president, or all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
I don't think so, to be honest. It's a rhetorical question, to be sure. I mean, it's nice to have maybe, but let's face it. In the past, when the United States, for example, had Christian presidents, was it a lot better? Well, some things maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, what I wrote in the book is the most crucial thing maybe in exile is that we hope can receive, that there is a promise there to receive a new understanding of God. That God is not the God of our nation, our tribe, our institutions, but the God of all the earth, and that God is a very surprising God who's greater than we thought he was. So the lesson that Israel learned in exile was that, well, God is not our God in the sense that God is not in our possession. Yeah. We don't have God in our pocket. So it's a humbling experience, I'd say, but also a hopeful experience because, you know, when God is so much entangled with your culture and your traditions and your institutions and the feeling of having power, then you can lose him. Maybe that's something that a lot of Christian Americans are fearing now. They're not just losing a Christian culture, but they're losing God altogether.
Yeah, that's insightful.
And that, I think, is not necessary. I mean, the stories, the narratives of the exile in the Old Testament can teach us a completely different thing. Think of Isaiah chapter 40, written in exile, where the prophet says, don't you remember that God is the God of the ends of the earth? He's here as well. And remember, that was sung by a poet who was in exile. He has seen it all. He had probably seen the temple being burned down, and the walls of Jerusalem being breached. I mean, think of it. If you think, it's amazing what we find in the Bible there. The whole faith of Israel was based on these three promises. One of the promise to Abraham, your seed, your descendants will always live here. The promise to David, there will always be someone from your dynasty on the throne. and the promise to Solomon, in this temple, in this house, I will let my name dwell. And then in one night, the Babylonians came over the wall, they burnt down the temple, they killed off the king, and they carried away the people. That was that. So, I think America, the American Christian culture is far better off than what happened there. It was just burnt down and killed off in one night.
Right.
So there was trauma. And read Lamentations. They just didn't feel traumatized in the sense of, let's say, the horrors that people see in wars, like today in Ukraine, but it was also traumatized in the relationship with God. If you read Lamentations, I think it's chapter 3 where Psalm 23 is sort of parody. You have been an unfaithful shepherd, O Lord. So the Lord is my shepherd. No, he's not my shepherd. You're a rod and staff. They're unreliable. So there's a very traumatized faith there. We don't know what we can believe about you, God, anymore. So in that situation, God reveals himself again in a new way. And I think that may be the core of the exilic situation. Think of the book of Daniel, for example. I remember listening to a sermon by Tim Keller once about that. I think this first sentence struck me because I had a sort of crisis of faith myself back then in those years in Amsterdam, where I felt quite abandoned and in exile. Then this first line of this sermon was, God himself carried Daniel into exile. That was the first sentence of the book of Daniel. And I thought, might it be true that God is involved in secularization?
Yeah.
That was for me a sort of key insight. I'm not sure that Keller meant that. I mean, you know how that works when you listen to a sermon. Your head starts spinning and you start thinking all sort of thing. But that was, I think, for me, a sort of core insight. It also led to the book. If God is involved in secularization, what is then a biblical frame to make sense of it? That's how I landed on exile and diaspora.
That's really insightful, and I think there's a couple ways to think about that. When you said, might God be involved in secularization? One, I don't think what you're saying is God is giving up on the culture or anything like that.
No,
but
on the contrary.
But rather that he's not afraid to position his people in a place where they have to rely on him more, and they cannot use the status quo, they can't use the things that they've always done, or they can't use political power in order to advance God's purposes in the world. They have to learn how to do that from a position of the margins.
Yes, as aliens or pilgrims or strangers, there's different words for that, but basically it all reflects the same reality. You don't have power anymore.
Yeah. In my own experience, I was befriended and became close friends with pastors at a lot of historic black churches when I was church planting, and they were very welcoming and very kind to me. But I learned something about this. I almost felt I did see that they were actually ahead of the curve from me in learning how to do this and learning how to operate on the margins, learning how to move things forward without the normal power systems that they could rely on. And so I think there's a temptation for people as they feel like they're losing the culture, quote unquote. You know, it can be easy to sort of merge our Christian identity with some sort of grievance or anger about displacement, resentfulness, or even just nostalgia for the past.
True.
You see a solution to that as the importance of identity maintenance. Identifying who we are as the people of God, whether we're in power or not. What is identity maintenance, and what does investing look like in ordinary church life?
Yeah, first of all, it's important to be very watchful about this resentfulness that you just mentioned. So that's the reason why I started with a new perspective of God. The culture never was ours to begin with, and of course. A second part of identity maintenance may be you don't have to deny the sadness or the trauma that is part of that. If your children don't go to church anymore, if you see, in your view at least, the country going to the dogs, it's not that, I mean, true or not true. I mean, but the Bible is not written to tell us you should stuff all those feelings. Again, read the Book of Lamentations, and you find a way to express those feelings of deep sadness, of feeling abandoned, of hopelessness, a trauma. What you don't find there is hatred against your neighbors or ways to grasp back power, but that's another issue. So coming back to this identity management or maintenance in, let's say, as a minority surrounded by a culture that is not necessarily hostile. That's important to say always. Sometimes the culture is hostile, but often it's just indifferent. Or, as the New Testament often says, it can respect certain Christian values. I mean, Apostle Paul and Peter, they all built on the idea that Christian behavior can also gain respect among people around you, even if they're not Christians. So all that is part of the very mixed Christian experience. So part of the identity maintenance is, I think, also to not get stuck in just one perspective on reality. You should be flexible enough to allow for all these different responses, and not and be very careful of saying if a non-Christian says something in public or to you, see, this just confirms the idea I always had about non-Christians.
Yeah.
No, this is one person.
Right.
And then when you come to the exilic experience of Israel, well, they invested a lot in raising their children. So there was, of course, circumcision, there was Sabbath, there was all sorts of food laws. So what's the equivalent for Christians for that? I mean, what we learned in Amsterdam was that if you don't raise your children, at least do the best you can. I mean, there are no guarantees, obviously. But if you don't really invest in them, also in their Christian formation, others will do it for you. So yeah, what we did in Amsterdam was very concrete. We always took them to church up to a certain age. Of course, you can't just force them to physically to come when they're 15, but we said this is a normal thing. We also tried to teach them, to help them to negotiate the fact that they were surrounded by people who didn't have a clue of what it meant to be a Christian. So in Amsterdam, I mean, that may be different in America, or maybe some cities like Seattle, it's basically the same thing probably. But to be in a classroom as a kid where all the children are raised by non-Christian parents. I mean, not parents who have gone to church in their childhood, no, parents who were raised as non-Christians as well. So in that environment, I've always tried, a bit of tongue-in-cheek maybe, said to my children, well, you know, they have a sort of limited perspective of the world. They don't know religious people. You know what non-religious people are. They don't have a clue. They just think that all the people are like them. So that's very tribal. Yes, you can help them to open the world a little bit for them, to get sort of more, let's say, layered or complex perspective of the world. And so that was part of it. Church, because we were one of the very few families in Amsterdam who had children in that age and who were Christians, we also worked together a lot. I mean, I think that's one thing you should do in cities. You should look each other up and try ways to do things together with your children. Let's say a camp or whatever you can do to give them some sort of feeling that they are not alone. So yeah, formation, I mean, in all sorts of ways, I think is very important to invest in. And to an extent, I think it's very important for Christians not to invest too much time in lamenting what the world has become, or how politics is, let's say, is abandoning us. But it's better to use that time to invest in your children and invest in the formation of young people, because that is basically, probably, humanly speaking, obviously, what decides our future as a Christian community, and not the amount of hours that you've spent on the internet lamenting the culture.
Yeah. I'm a pastor of family ministries at the church I work at, Spanish River Church in Boca Raton, Florida. And part of that is I oversee all the ministries that deal with ages 0 to 18. And I've really enjoyed seeing what God is doing among the children here, and thinking long term about their formation, and how do we, you know, if a child comes to us at age 0, 1 month old or something like that, what's the plan to help form them and partner with the parents so that at age 18 they can go out into the world and make a difference for Christ. And over the past month, I've been spending time with the young adults. So this is ages 18 to 26. And we've spent our Thursday
Great
evenings
age.
walking through Jonah, which I think has a lot to say in our political moment about our posture towards people that we believe are evil and that have political systems we don't agree with. And it's been very fun to watch them wrestle with these things and think about what it means for their own identity. Because so much
Yeah,
of
that's great.
the
Very good.
consumption on these things is it's all about microphone, like mic drop moments, like own your political enemies and dismantle
Destroy them.
destroy
Yeah,
them.
that kind of
Yes,
stuff.
yeah,
Horrible term.
yeah. Sheesh.
Yeah.
So
When the Christians get the commandment, you should destroy your enemies. But anyways,
one of the things that was really, for me, my biggest takeaway from your book, Pilgrims and Priests, was your 6 models for churches. I just thought the way that you put those together really made sense. You came up with 6 Western church responses to secularization. There's the folk church, the countercultural church, the church growth movement church, transformation church, church inside out, and then the neo-Pentecostal powerhouse church.
yeah.
I thought that was really helpful. Each church responds to the secularization in a different way, and each church has a strength and weakness with it.
Sure.
For instance, the folk church model tends to merge their religious identity with national identity. I thought that was really interesting. But what do you see? What do you see maybe from afar? You're in the Netherlands, but what instincts do you see in American evangelicals, and what kind of church we're most drawn to right now? Now, I know that you're not on the ground, but I'm just curious your perspective as a missiologist in the Netherlands.
Yeah. That's a very difficult question to answer, also because it would be preposterous to have a view of American church life as a Dutchman. So the only thing I can say about it is what reaches me from across the pond.
Sure.
On discussion. So what we, and of course you always hear the bad news. So about Christian nationalism and all that, and the kind of pretty cultish people that surround the current administration. But I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of churches and Christians in the United States that fight the good fight, either on the more conservative or the more progressive side. I mean, that is not really that important. The one concern that I have, what I hear from friends in America who often tend to be pastors, let's say former PhD students of mine, for example, is that church life in America tends to get very politicized as well.
Mm-hmm.
That may be different in different churches, but what I hear is that it becomes increasingly problematic for pastors, for example, to proclaim the gospel without immediately being suspected of belonging to a certain political tribe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Which I think is deeply problematic. And that is really a sickness of our times. It is a bit less so in the Netherlands or in Europe at large, I suppose, because we usually have multiple party systems. I think part of the problem may be that in the United States you're either a Democrat or Republican, and these parties sociologically, culturally have grown apart so much that basically it seems that America is populated by 2 different tribes competing for power. At least that's a sort of image that is forming from where I am looking. As Christians, there's different ways you can go. There is, of course, you can say, well, we should be prophetic, like the recent initiative by Jim Wallace and Sean Claiborne and others. I sympathize with that, but to be prophetic is a very difficult challenge if it's not rooted in actual commitment to communities, neighborhoods. And I'm not saying that they aren't, but generally I'd say that's very important, that any prophetic voice that you're raising should be coming from those who are really suffering under the kind of measures that you're fighting against. Otherwise it becomes just what Musa Al-Gharbi, the American sociologist, calls a sort of symbolic capital pushing. So there is all the debates between a certain well-educated class, either right-wing or left-wing, who just accuse each other from all sorts of things and have a lot of things to say about what America should be or what it shouldn't. But the problem is that many people who are less well-educated, less verbally equipped, have less access to the big podia, are abandoned by those discourses. So I think the church can play an important role here by and again, it's not rocket science, but basically by being the church, by really being committed to the neighborhoods, loving the neighbors and especially their enemies, which means, I mean, loving your enemies doesn't necessarily mean that you like them, otherwise they wouldn't be enemies, right? But that you try to do justice to them.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Bible, love is deeply connected with peace seeking, and peace in the Bible and the prophets is always this composed of seeking justice, reconciliation, and joy. You find it in the prophets everywhere. So these three components, I would say, would also mean what it means to love your neighbor and your enemies. If I am harshly criticized by someone who sees himself as my enemy or behaves like an enemy, my first job is to do justice to this person. So I think at the very least try to understand where this comes from. What moves this person to be so harsh against me, and how can I respond in such a way that I do justice to him, which doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with him or that we will not end up in a fight, but at least I can do everything what is in my powers to do justice to this person. Whereas what you often see, especially in these deeply polarized climates of ours, is that the first response is, how can I hurt him even more than he has hurt me?
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm sounding a bit pious here. I'm not saying that I always abide by this law, but I really work on it. I think one of the most important virtues that Christians nowadays can develop and should develop is how can we love our enemies?
Yeah. Stefan, it's so interesting because we literally just talked about that in the last episode, and it reminds me of how closely that goes with identity formation. I think about during the civil rights movement in the United States, how when they had sit-ins in restaurants where people of color were not allowed to be, they had practiced beforehand what it would be like to be shouted at by enemies, and they had gotten a sense of settledness in who they were as people.
Exactly.
And that enabled them to have the power to operate in that moment and actually not do harm to their enemies that were literally yelling in their faces at that moment. So I think that's so profound. And I think that love of enemy is the ethic that sent Jesus to the cross for us. And so it's not an optional side thing that we'll get to eventually in our discipleship. Really, it's at the core of who we are.
And the good news for Christians is there are lots of enemies now, so we can really practice.
Yeah,
I mean, in a culture that is essentially Christian, where Christians run the show, there are not many enemies to go by. I mean, maybe some far away or in Russia, back in the days when the Iron Curtain was still up. But where are they now? I mean, they're just around the corner. People are very good at hating each other nowadays. So there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I want to close with a couple of questions just about missiological frameworks and kingdom. In the book, you talk about the difference between seeing the kingdom of God not as something as like we expand until it covers everything, but rather as God's eschatological reign, drawing the world towards a future shalom. So not necessarily covering geography, but rather living in chronology. Not necessarily about territory that we're taking, but rather a time that we're drawing from to live in the present. How does that definition of the kingdom of God and how it affects us as the people of God reshape our understanding of success and impact and what we even expect from mission?
Yeah, so I wrote a book on this. I could give a very long answer, but I think the core of my answer would be what I wrote in the book about doxology.
Mm.
So there is doxology, let's say, singing praises, talking glory. What does that mean? That we should learn to recognize the beauty and the greatness of anything that is not necessarily efficient or leading to great results. So to doxologize, to praise God, basically means that we say, I think at least that is what it means, that there is someone who is just good, period. Not good for something, not good because he helps us, heals us, gives us wealth or whatever. No, he's just good, period. So God is goodness himself. Now, if you, let's say, think through that and apply this to all the things divine, all the things that come from God, they have something of this divine quality of intrinsic goodness, of intrinsic beauty. It's easier said than done. I mean, we as modern Western people, we tend to instrumentalize everything, including evangelism and witness and helping the poor. There's always a deep sense of, yeah, but at the very least people should be grateful to us, or at the very least they should respect us for it. And even better, the church should grow from it. But if all that doesn't really happen, as it tends to be the case in more secular contexts, then I think we are pushed to the core of our identity, namely that we are people who are called to praise and to doxologize. Now, that has sometimes led me to the idea that mission needs new metaphors. We've all, well, let's say the early generation of missiologists and missionaries spoke about mission often in terms of the military, of waging wars, sending out armies of well-trained missionaries and occupy countries and territories. Even McGavran talks about it that way, church growth rhetoric. We've reeled back a little bit from that, and the language of business took over. Think of Willow Creek and all that. So targets, setting out, outlining the organization, having mission statements that can be put on a T-shirt, stuff like that. But maybe the language of art is actually a far better way to say what mission is when it comes to doing mission in a culture, in a context where little success is to be expected. Then mission, then the basic question is, why should you do it if it doesn't have a lot of success? Well, because it's beautiful, because it's good, because it testifies about someone who loves us freely. And that, I think, is maybe the most important lesson of what we should learn, and not just learning in a cognitive sense, but it's also an identity matter. I mean, I think one of the issues of living in a secularized age context is that we learn to see how much of our faith is entangled with instrumentalism, with effectiveness, with success, with power, with prestige. We're all denying that it is that way. I mean, formally we say, yeah, that shouldn't be the case. But the point is, existentially, coming from centuries of Christendom, it is the case. I mean, we learn to discover that in a situation of exile. So maybe the most important spiritual lesson that we should learn is how to do things for the beauty they have, for the divine beauty that they have in themselves, and that. And of course, I'm now sort of contradicting myself. Actually, the attractiveness of Christianity for late modern, post-secular citizens may be exactly there. There are a couple of people here in our midst who seem to do things not because they make money or have success, or even because they build prestige, but they have found some language and some practices that seem to say that things may not be worth a lot in terms of money, but they have deep value. And was it Oscar Wilde who once said that modern people tend to see the worth of everything and the value of nothing, something like that. And what he meant is that they can express anything in terms of monetary value of money, but they have a lot of they have a very hard time to express anything that goes beyond that, because we've sort of lost the language for that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe Christians are people who can. Maybe that's also a reason why a lot of these young people come to these highly liturgical churches, Because, I mean, face it, if you spend a lot of energy, money, time on a beautiful liturgy, I mean, it's not efficient, is it? I mean, they say everything 3 times and rather than just once, and they turn circles and they do things with candles and all that. It costs a lot of money. I mean, but it's not about efficiency. It's clear. It's clear. It's about intrinsic beauty and intrinsic value.
Right.
And yeah.
I'll close with just a brief story. I forgot about this quote until you said art. I forgot about this quote from your book, but I'll just give you, before I give you the quote, I'll tell you just a little bit about why one of your quotes from your book is so meaningful to me. I planted a church in a very, in an urban, very racially diverse part of South Florida. We had very wealthy people and very working class or lower class people from various ethnic backgrounds. And it was very challenging to plant during the political divisiveness of 2016. That's actually when we launched the church. And it was a really beautiful, small church for 10 years. And then we lost our building, we had financial challenges, and ultimately, I think it was, 2024, we actually had to close the church. And it was very challenging for our people because after 10 years, and all these great things that had happened, people's lives had been changed. We got people who were diverse to sit down and talk to each other. Families had been transformed. And they kind of said, like, well, why? Like, what is God doing? And why did it close after 10 years? And one of the things I kept bringing people back to was that God had done something beautiful in a small way through what he was doing at our church. And I reference this quote. I'll read it to you. Christians are invited to cut out small niches of hope, reconciliation, forgiveness, beauty, and health in the world. There is something entirely non-instrumental in a work of art. It is just there. It's not good for anything. It just radiates goodness, beauty, challenge, and mystery. We are not to expect that a beautiful sculpture will change the world into a paradise, but it will give the world something to think and talk about just by being there, inviting love and longing. So this may be our task, a mission of small things, things that will be redeemed when Jesus returns. End of quote.
Yeah.
I love that quote. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's from the bottom of my heart. I mean, that's really what I've come to learn in Amsterdam, among other places where I've worked. Yeah.
Stefan, thank you so much for joining us on Post Everything. We really enjoyed having you on, and thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
That was a really thought-provoking interview with Dr. Stefan Paas, and I wish I had my co-host here to process with me. But 3 things stick out. The first one is this. Dr. Paas asked, might God be involved in secularization? That blew some circuits in my mind. How could that be? Well, it makes sense if you think about the idea that God was actually involved and the orchestrator of bringing his people into exile in Babylon. And God being involved in our exile in secularization can only make sense if we are reminded that the best place for the people of God to influence is from the margins. Our job is not to take over a culture, but rather to represent him to a watching culture. On page 30 of his book, Pilgrims and Priests, Dr. Paas says, Oliver Donovan would argue that the church should witness about the kingdom rather than strive for worldly influence, but that at the same time it should be responsive to any sign that the world has become attentive to this witness. End of quote. Now, I know the question is, don't we want as many people as possible to come to Christ? Yes. Don't we as Christians want to see our culture transformed by Christ? Yes. But how does that happen? Is it by us choosing the right people to become Christians or winning the right people to Christ in order that they may influence others? Is it by us taking positions of power and then influencing so that that would trickle down? Well, that has happened in history. but it's not really how God picked Israel to be his people, nor how Jesus picked his disciples to follow him. God did not pick Israel because he thought that they would be influential. Rather, he picked them because he purposed to make them his priestly people. And the same with Jesus. Jesus didn't pick the up-and-comers, the shining stars. Rather, he picked common men to represent him. And so Paas says, if we're going to think missionally in this post-Christian moment, we have to consider a couple things. First, the difference between the church and the world must be respected. The world is not meant to become the church, nor should the church be confused with the world. Then he also says we need to stop trying to make the world into the church by conquest. Rather, our job is to represent God to the world, not take over the world. And Paas says in this missionary vision for our post-cultural, post-Christian moment, we have to develop a spirituality and formation fit deeply for our cultural moment of secularization. I'll get into that in just a minute. To quote Paas again from page 110 of Pilgrims and Priests, Christians will have to learn to make their spirituality independent of success in terms of church growth or world improvement. They will learn how to develop a spirituality of signs and foretastes. End of quote. Now, that's not to say that growth, success, making an impact in the world is bad. It's not saying that at all. It's saying that too often we judge our identity by our ability to make an impact rather than understanding who we are as the people of God. That our mission is first and foremost to witness to what is to come, that Christ will return and make all things new. Every time we take the Lord's Supper, we proclaim his death until he returns. And so Paas goes on to explain what it's like to live in exile. He says, exile is a time of confusion. It's a time when you lose political power and you're pushed to the margins, and that is very confusing, and that confusion is actually okay. Dr. Paas would also say that exile requires us to look after our identity as the people of God. If you go back and read the book of Daniel, you'll see there's this tension between the names they've been given in Babylon and their Hebrew names. And it's interesting to consider, what are they doing to tend after who they are as the people of God as they live among the people of Babylon? But then, as I said earlier, Paas talks about a spirituality that's fit for the moment, where secularization is the predominant way of thinking. And he says there's 4 elements to that spirituality. One is a lament that creates space for how angry we are that it's hard to be a minority people, but also allows us to bring our natural tendency for bitterness and revenge towards the God who has brought us into exile. So lament's number 1. Number 2 is confession and repentance. That we actually need to repent how we are trying to use power to bring about the purposes of God, rather than accept that we've been brought into exile by God. Confession and repentance. Third, sacramentality, that we actually learn to treasure the things that God has given us that are foretastes of the future. Rather than treasuring things like consumerism, rather, we look to the signs and seals of the sacrament as what is most real. And then lastly, testimony. We learn how to speak not from places of power, but from the underbelly of society. That we actually give testimony to what God is doing, not through taking over and being in power, but rather what God is doing in us and among us as we're in the margins. So that was my number 1 takeaway right there. Might God be involved in secularization? Second, secularization is the sum of a million decisions. That quote from Dr. Paas convicted me because I wondered, how many decisions am I making every day that are secular, that aren't based on my relationship with God, but acting as if I'm this independent planet in the solar system that doesn't have a gravitational pull towards the sun. It's so crucial that we recognize that and that we rebel against it by leaning into our own spiritual formation and rhythms. I mean, just think about the way the calendar works in a secular mindset. It's so different than the church calendar and the themes of Lent, the themes of Advent and expectation, the themes of Pentecost. Letting the church calendar set our year is just an act of rebellion against the secularization of time. Not only that, think about praying the hours, waking up every day and setting a rhythm of prayer throughout your day, saying, I'm going to let Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the risen one who's ascended and reigning and ruling at the right hand of God, I'm going to let that set the tone throughout my day by praying the hours. Or even family meals. Having a family meal can be an act of rebellion against secularization, because it's so tempted just to say what matters is that we plop down in front of the TV or we go to the next practice for the kids, rather than saying, no, what matters most is that we come together at the end of the day in relationship as children of God. And even some like less concrete things, doing things that don't lead to results, doing things that aren't optimized or gaining ground can actually be a form of rebellion against secularization. Because secularization says there is no God, so what matters most is that you optimize everything, that you gain ground so you can get ahead. And even just resting, even just praying at night before you go to bed, which in one sense feels like it does nothing, can be an act of rebellion of secularization, because we know every prayer we say is heard in the heavens by our God. Third, Dr. Paas talked about our divided political climate here in the United States, and I love the way he framed it. You all have so many enemies in the United States, but that really means there's lots of opportunities to love your enemies. What an interesting way to think about it. We've been coming back to this over and over in this season, that the core ethic of the kingdom of God, what actually Jesus announced from the cross, is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What if we viewed all the enemies we had not as people to own, not as looking for mic drop moments with them, but rather opportunities for us to show who God is and represent him, even from the margins. Dr. Paas in his book, page 203, says, evangelism, therefore, is all about making friends, creating relationships, and making these relationships a channel of deep and rich human contact, a location for witness. And I believe by that, Dr. Paas even meant our enemies. Our enemies are an unbelievable place for us to be witnesses of the kingdom of God by forgiving them, by loving them, by seeing them as places of opportunity to show who God is. And I know that's hard, but I want to encourage you. You can start right now by praying for them. That person that comes to mind, that group of people that comes to mind, why don't you start by praying for them now? I hope you were encouraged by this interview with Dr. Stefan Paas. We'll see you next time on Post Everything.
Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, text it to a friend. Please take a minute and rate this podcast. Leaving a review helps other people find us and connect. You can send us questions or feedback by emailing us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com. Thank you.